No, I do have a little bit of a confession to make, and that is when I was 15, we've all done some stupid things when we're 15, right? Some of us did some stupid things this morning. But when I was 15, I had a friend who was just a little bit ahead of me. He had his license. He was 16, and he said, hey, my brother's throwing a party. My brother's over 21. Do you want to go hang out at this party? I said, yes, I do. I want to go to this party. So we go to this brother's party, and he has a lot of alcohol there. And we're like, this is what we were hoping for. And so we did what we had intended to do, and we did it very well. So well that I passed out in the bathroom on the floor, got really sick, woke up, didn't feel the best, went home, not right home, actually, I went to my friend's home. We hung out during the day. This was over the weekend. We hung out the rest of the day. I took a shower at his house, and I kind of got refreshened, and so I didn't look like somebody who had just done the things I had just done when I went home and talked to my dad, who's a pastor, right? So I go home, and it's actually a couple days have passed since this party has taken place, and my dad's driving me, and we're in the car, and out of the blue, he says, hey, what'd you do last weekend with your friend? I was like, we hung out, obviously. And he was like, okay. So you didn't go to his brother's house and get drunk? I was like, what a silly thing to say. The things you come up with. And he was like, no, like seriously, did you do that? And I was like, no, I don't think so. He caught me so off guard, I couldn't even lie well, right? I couldn't even give him a straight no. I was like, I don't know what you're talking about, man. And can you pull over and let me out right now? Like, that would be awesome. And so he's like, no, I know, like, not only did you go do that, but no offense, but you were kind of dumb, and you went to your school and you bragged about it. This is a town of 1,700 people. Like, we know everybody. And I had the audacity to still deny it. I'm like, this must have been somebody else. I don't know. Check with my older brother. Maybe it was him. And he was like, no, I want you to admit it. And there was part of me that still didn't want to admit. Like, I didn't want to own up to what I had done, even though I knew that I was doing something that was illegal, could have gotten people in trouble, that, like, was against my family values and what even I felt guilty about this. But I didn't want to own up to it. Now, some people that I've met, maybe even many of you, what bothers you is if somebody accuses you of something that you haven't done wrong. Like, that's my reputation. I don't care about that, right? Like, if I get accused of something I know isn't true about me, I really don't care because I know what's true. What bothers me is when somebody catches me and accuses me of something that I've done wrong that I know is wrong. I'm like, I didn't think you'd see that. I didn't want to get caught. I feel embarrassed. I feel ashamed. I'd rather have somebody accuse me of something that's incorrect than something that's true about me. And that really bothered me. I had a hard time owning up to it. Now, I don't know where you sit. I don't think anybody really likes to be accused of things. I would prefer if the things that I was accused of, that people didn't like, were actually true things, but not bad things. Like, that's where I wish I was at in life. I wish that I lived in such a way that people were like, hey, I don't like this about you, but it's still a good thing. We kind of talked about reputation, especially like organizational reputation last week. And I kind of like to pick up on another theme of that again, and kind of through the lens of accusation. Because I got reading some material about the church that existed, the followers of Jesus that existed from the years of about 100 AD to 200 AD. So really, really early church. All the apostles that we would read about, all those followers of Jesus that are written about in Scripture, maybe a couple are hanging on at the early days, but definitely by 200 AD, they're not around anymore. And so this thing that is now the church has to have some legs to it. And now here's the thing that we need to be aware of about those times, is that it was actually an incredibly rough time to be a follower of Jesus. Incredible persecution was coming up against the church. In fact, Christians were actually mocked and killed for sport. Right? That's kind of a crazy thing to wrap our minds around. They did some really good things, but they got accused for those good things because the world around them didn't see them as good. I want to read just a couple of phrases of things that the church was accused about that was actually true of them. And these are just a couple of the things that are recorded. One is from a philosopher who lived around 175 AD. His name was Calchas. Okay, I think that's how you say it. I've never met him, so he never had a chance to correct me. Calchas was a philosopher, and he was adamantly against the church and against Christians. And he said this, one of the reasons he hated Christians is that they show they want and are able to convince only the foolish, dishonorable, and stupid. And then he further defines it if he's not being offensive enough. Only slaves, women, and little children. Like, this was this guy's complaint against the church. He was like, if they were actually good, if they were actually able to, they'd attract better people. But right now, they're filled with slaves, women, and children. So he didn't like them. Another guy with somewhat of a similar, difficult-to-pronounce name, Caecilius, was also an early opponent of Christianity, and he really trashed the reputation of the church on more than one occasion. And his quote is that he hated the church because the church could only recruit people, in his words, who were from the dregs of the populace and credulous women with the inability natural to their sex. Right? So he hated the fact that they were the early church was filled with this kind of people. Now, that might seem weird to us, but you have to understand, slaves, especially women and children, they had no value. They had no status. They didn't have rights. They didn't have any of those things. They were actually considered subhuman. And this is the group that the church was filled with. In fact, one of the ways the early church grew is it was a regular practice. It was legal in Rome at that time that if you didn't want a child that you had given birth to, you could put it out into the road to expose it and just leave it there because you didn't want it. Now, one of the reasons the early church grew in number at that time is because the early Christians would go along and they would pick up all those babies, believing that every single person has inherent value. This is why they were accused. This is the reality of the church. And it's hard for me not to contrast that with today because I believe everybody sitting here, regardless of what you believe, has an opinion about the church. You have experience with it or you've heard something of it. It has a reputation and you have a thought about that. And when you look at what the world's thoughts are about the church today, there's a whole group of people who are walking away or rejecting the church because of what they believe is true about us, what we're being accused of today. It's actually not the same things as the early church was accused of. The things that we're accused of today is the church would rather be right than loving. The church is pretty exclusive. They care way too much about money. They care about all these things that don't seem to be life-changing. I've actually heard that from people I'm related to. I don't see that faith really makes a day-to-day difference, so what's the point? Now, if that wasn't true about us, if that was an accusation that wasn't true, I could get past it. But the problem is I think it's true. I think it's true about the way we've operated, and that bothers me. I think at some level, for all of us, it should be bothersome. But I think there's a different picture that we can find. There's a way that we can be different. There's a way that we can allow our opinions of the heart of the church to be changed and transformed, but we have to go back to the original message of Jesus. So we're going to go to Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. If you're able to follow along on your phone or on the screen, that's great. If you want to follow along in your Bible, that's awesome too. What we have is Jesus is teaching, and he teaches in a parable here. And he's teaching if you go back just a couple verses, you'll see that he's speaking to a group of people that's identified as chief priests and Pharisees. Now, chief priests and Pharisees, these are the religious elite. They had a disproportionate amount of social power and standing, and they were considered to be very good and righteous people. They did a lot of good things, okay? They looked very good. They followed a lot of rules, but they were also pretty judgy, okay? You didn't want to get on the bad side of them because they also wielded some pretty significant influence in the world around them. And Jesus is speaking to them. So I just want you to wrap your mind around that when we read some pretty bold words, okay? We read this. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent more servants and said, 'Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find.' So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good. And the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. And he asked, 'How did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend?' The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, 'Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.'" Now, we're going to get into this story. I want you to hold a couple things in mind. Like we just said, Jesus is telling this story to the religious elite, the chief priests and the Pharisees. But I also want you to take into account something else. This is not just the Bible we're reading. Okay, the Bible is made up, it's a collection of writings. Okay, it's not one cohesive work, it's a collection of writings. This particular writing is done by a guy named Matthew, who was one of Jesus' closest followers. He had followed Jesus through his ministry, but that's not the incredible thing. The incredible thing is the type of person Matthew was. The type of person Matthew was a Roman tax collector. Not by birth, actually by birth, Matthew was a Jewish male. But he was a Jewish citizen, a Jewish person who was also a tax collector for the city of Rome. Now, tax collectors were despised because they collected and actually stole at times money for Rome from the citizens. They were part of the oppressive machine of Rome. Worse than that, tax collectors were hated by Jewish people because they were being oppressed by Rome. Worse than that, Jewish tax collectors were hated by Jewish people because they were traitors to their own people. So this is Matthew. One day, Jesus comes along and he calls Matthew to him. Matthew starts hanging around Jesus more, and something happens in Matthew. You see, Matthew was willing to throw away every social relationship that he had. He was willing to be an outcast to his family and friends in order to pursue the wealth that came through serving Rome. But when Jesus comes along, he hears Jesus, he sees what Jesus does, and something clicks in Matthew. He's like, this guy is who he says he is. So not only was he willing to give up, was Matthew willing to give up every social relationship, he was willing to give up the wealth that he had accumulated in order to follow Jesus. More than that, he was willing to give up his own life to follow Jesus. That's how much Matthew believed Jesus is who he says he is. So we have kind of two contrasting things. We have in the foreground and in the front of this message, we have that Jesus is speaking to this religious elite group that has it all together. They're doing everything right. These are the kind of people you think should be following Jesus, but we have the account written by a guy named Matthew, who is the kind of person that you think that's the last person that should follow Jesus. And Matthew gives this account, and he starts talking about a parable. A parable is simply a story that has some kind of intent to it. It's a story with intent. It's a story that has purpose behind it, and Jesus spoke in these parables often. In this particular one, it starts with the kingdom. Now, the kingdom has two layers to it. First layer is the obvious one, that they are in the kingdom, they're in the empire of Rome. Okay, so they understand what a king does. They understand the king in Rome is actually the emperor, and he oppresses people, he conquers people, and he takes from people through people like Matthew. But we have this other understanding of king that would be understood by the religious elite Jesus is talking to. You see, the Jews had been praying not just for a king, but a deliverer who would be like God himself, that would bring in God as king, the way God would rule here, just like Caesar does. It's being compared, but it's different. Caesar takes, he conquers. Jesus shows that God's kingdom is much different. God is king. He invites and he gives. There's two different kingdoms here that are being contrasted. And so Jesus is talking about that God type of kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is what he calls it. It's like this, he says. It's like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited. Okay, so catch that. There's a group of people that have already been put on the guest list. All right? Maybe they already got the save the date invitation in the mail. All right? Maybe there was already an argument between the soon-to-be son-in-law and the soon-to-be mother-in-law about what types of invitations should go out, and maybe there was a little snafu there. Maybe I'm inserting my own experience here. I don't know. So the servants are sent out to those who had already been invited to the banquet. Okay, so here's a little bit more parallel. The parallel here being made is that Jesus is telling a story to the Pharisees about the Pharisees. Do you catch his boldness? Jesus was bold. He's a bit crazy, all right? So he sends, in this story, the king sends the servants out to the people who had already gotten the RSVP to the banquet for his son. And when they get the servants' messages, the reminder, they refuse to come. They had gotten the initial invitation. Now there's a follow-up invitation, but the servants refuse to come. If we continue on reading, we see that in response to this, the king then sends more servants, presumably a little bit later on, because this is a little bit preposterous, okay? If a king invites you to a wedding, you go. But he sends more servants, and he says, "Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened calf have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet." All right, so it's not bad enough that they've kind of refused. They've really insulted the king at this point. More than that, they're on the edge of treason. That's how serious this is. In fact, we read from scholar Leon Morris that is pretty severe. Leon Morris comments on this passage saying, "This was something completely unnatural. In real life, a royal invitation is not refused, and people are very glad to be present at a royal banquet. When they were summoned by the King of Heaven," okay, here's the parallel coming in, "they should surely have complied with his gracious invitation, but they did not. Their outward profession was a long way from the glad acceptance of the ways of God that was looked for from men in their position." Leon Morris is referring to Jesus' audience, right? Jesus is speaking to the religious elite. They are presumably those who have been invited. They were already on the guest list. This is a reference back to Israel's entire history. Israel in general had been invited to the banquet, to be in communion, to be around the table of God with him. They were invited to be in relationship with the King of Heaven and his son, but they refused to come. The refusal is seen that Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees and the religious teachers when all around him are people like Matthew. They refuse to come. This is tantamount to treason. In the story, there's invitation after invitation, and more than that, it's not just an invitation. It's like, okay, you rejected me, but maybe you don't understand how good this is going to be. Like, we are throwing a killer barbecue. Like, if you don't like me, at least come for the food. The understanding is that the king is doing everything he can to entice the initial invitees to come. But again, we read in verse 5, they paid no attention and they went off. And what do? They go off to their regular business. Apparently, whatever they had to do in their day-to-day is more important than responding to the king. One goes off to his field to plow and to harvest or whatever was going on with growing food at the time. Another one's running a business, and so he goes off. But there's some that are even worse, okay? We read in verse 6 that the rest of his servants seized them, and they mistreated them and killed them. Right? This is pretty extreme. Now we're full past the line of treason. This is not just a simple refusal. This is not a slap in the face to the king. This is almost declaring war against the king. Now, again, just a bit of history for people who care about that sort of thing. This is actually going back in Israel's history a little bit, because what the Pharisees and the chief priests represent is a nation that's been invited into relationship with God, but time and time again have refused him. And God has even sent some messengers to them that were called prophets. And you know what they did with them is they mistreated some of them and they killed some of them. They knew that their ancestors had killed the prophets, and by extension, accepting their lineage, they're like, you're guilty by association. You are part of a family line that you are incredibly proud of that has blood on its hands. That's what Jesus is pointing out in this passage. So, the king, in the story, verse 7, he was enraged. Of course he was. This is declaration of war. And so he responds in kind, and he sends his army, and he destroys those murderers and burn their city. Now, this is where maybe the parallel breaks down a little bit, because Jesus is not the kind of person who's building an army to go and kill people. That's never been his thing. In fact, some of his followers thought that was his thing, and he's like, you just don't get it, do you? Like, I'm not here to conquer people. I'm here to save and to bless them. Like, that's my mission. That's what this looks like. But this king, he does what would just be natural for a king to do. As we continue reading in verse 8, there's one more thing the king does. He's like, well, the food's ready. The party's ready. Be ashamed to not have anybody enjoy it. Like, this is way too much food for us. So the king, once again, he grabs his servants together, and he says, listen, the wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. Now, wait a second. They were invited, but they didn't deserve to come? Well, what's going on there? Like, I thought that they didn't come because they refused to come, not because they didn't deserve. But here's where we get a little bit of understanding about who is deserving and who isn't deserving. You see, the invitation goes out to these people, not because they were deserving. What proved that they were undeserving was their simple refusal to respond. That's it. So we get this fuller picture that the people who were invited, they weren't invited because they had done anything to deserve the invitation. They weren't invited because they had done so much good stuff. They weren't invited because the kind of life they lived, or how much they prayed, or how much they read the scripture, or how much they attended their version of church. None of that mattered. What proved them undeserving was the simple fact that they didn't respond to the invitation to the dinner. That's it. You see, what we have to understand in this passage is that very clearly Jesus is differentiating something for us. He's differentiating the difference between invitation and response. Invitation is one thing, but it's not enough. Right? You can be invited to something, but if you don't respond to the invitation, you didn't take part in it. Jesus is saying that's what makes that group of people, that's what makes those, the people who were invited, they were undeserving to come. So the next thing in verse 9 we read, so go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you can find. Right? Like, do you know what anyone means in the original Greek that this was written? It means anyone. Okay? There's no secrets there. It means anyone. Go and invite anyone and everyone. And he says, so go out to the streets. And so that's what the servants do. So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find. If they saw them, they gathered them. They're like, come on, there's a feast. The calf's ready. Like, there's a barbecue on. There's way too much food. Come on, go home and grab somebody. Like, let's go. And there's some significance to the street corners as well. The first time, the servants were sent out to the people who had been invited. Now, these were reflecting the chief priests and the Pharisees. These were the people that were kind of elevated, at least in Jewish society, not in Roman society, but in Jewish society. They had some level there. It made sense that they were invited. And now the servants go out and they're just willy-nilly inviting anybody. It doesn't even make sense. Right? There's no rhyme or reason. It's like you see them, invite them. And the street corners are significant because this is kind of starting to represent the edges of the city. Right? These are the people that have no right being involved in palace life. These are people that have no right being involved in the king's meal, but they gather them anyway. We could even understand it to go so far as to understand this. At the edges of their towns at that time, anybody who was considered unclean was removed from society. So if you had a skin disease or if you were believed to be contagious, they didn't have medical treatment for it, and so you had to leave your family, and you had to leave your friends, you had to leave your business, and you had to live outside the city. You had to be an outcast. You were unclean, and when people walked by you, you had to shout, unclean, right? I'm glad every time I have a cold, I don't have to sit outside my house and when somebody, like mailman, unclean. I'm going to actually try that next time. That might be kind of fun. But I'm going to hide. It's going to be good. So the understanding here is that it wasn't just anybody. It was even anybody from the edges of society that had been rejected and considered beneath the rest of the commoners. And we can believe that because what happens, we read in verse 10, is that the servants went out and they found all the people they could find. And then there's this kind of description. It's the bad as well as the good. Wait. Isn't this a parallel between kind of the king is representing God? Isn't that what's happening? Yeah, that's what's happening. Doesn't God want us to be nice? I don't know. I think God wants something for us, but apparently none of that's a prerequisite to joining him around the banquet. Apparently, being good or bad has nothing to do with receiving the invitation. So while the chief priests now are seeing this story unfold, they're like, wait a second, he just called us undeserving. He just called us murderers. And he just told us all the sinners that we won't even associate with in case it rubs off on us. They're deserving. They just got the invitation. Now they're getting upset. They had actually, if you look back, they had already been looking, these chief priests and Pharisees, they had already been looking, they were so upset with the message of Jesus, they were trying to find a way to kill him. I don't think this helped. I think this probably made some matters worse. I think they're like, okay, now today, like this is happening today. Like let's figure out something to get rid of this guy because now he just told a story to us, about us, in the presence of everybody. He just shamed us. And worse, he just said that the unclean and the sinners, even this tax collector Matthew, is more deserving than I am. That's bold. It's also the heart of Jesus. So you see, I think that we see the reputation of the early church from 100 AD and probably earlier than that as well and later than that. In fact, the early church had a good reputation for being kind of crazy like that, picking up the infants in the street. They were that way until they got mixed up with centralized governmental power with Constantine. It wasn't until the church was sponsored by Constantine that it started going away and the rich started coming in. Until then, it was made up of complete riffraff. In fact, you might even say it was made up of anybody they could find, the good and the bad. Jesus has always been after anybody who's not just invited, but anybody who will respond. You see, the invitation isn't the same as the response. But then we get into this kind of weird part, okay? And it's okay if you think it's weird. I kind of think it's weird too. Verse 11, we read this, "But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes." Okay? I've been to a wedding where people are just in shorts and a t-shirt. Okay? So this is kind of hard sometimes to understand, but there were kind of social protocols going on. Like this was a celebration. And wedding feasts didn't just go for a couple hours, okay? They didn't even just dance late into the night. Like they were part of celebrations that were wild and wine-filled and looked incredibly insane with massive amounts of food that would go on for days, sometimes weeks. Right? Yeah, that sounds pretty good. Sign me up. Where's this invitation? But then the king comes in. Now, he had sent the servants out, but up until this point, he hasn't looked to see who had actually responded to his invitation yet. So he goes into the wedding hall, and he starts peeking around. He's like, oh, yeah, it's great. It's full. This is exactly what I was hoping for my son when I send the invitations out. But then he's like, oh, wait a second. So what's that person doing back there? He's not dressed in the wedding clothes. So he goes up to the gentleman and he says, how'd you get in here without wedding clothes, friend? And the man was speechless. Now, let's pause there before we get to this kind of crazy thing that happens, because if we don't understand what just happened, then the king starts to look not so gracious and not so kind anymore, right? It's kind of confusing. So I want to just try to quickly explain this, that there was kind of a practice that, especially in the position the king was in, and especially the way the invitations went out, that if you had months to prepare, you'd be able to get your best clothes ready. You'd be able to have the finest linen sewn into an outfit. Now, we're not talking somebody who just went to their closet and picked from their closet. They didn't have a depth of closet like we might today, okay? They had to get prepared for this, and it would have been costly to go to a king's banquet. But the servants were sent out in such haste, like the time is now. The time to respond is now. You don't have time to prepare, just get in. It doesn't matter whether you're good or bad, just get in. Walk in here. I don't care if you're leaving the field and you're filthy, get into the banquet hall. And because of that, it would have been customary for the king to provide his guests with wedding clothing. They would have come in and his attendants would have washed their feet. They might have even had to bathe in the king's palace in order to get ready, and they might have had to oil up because their skin would have been dry and cracked, and so they would put on the king's oils, which were way better than anything they had, and then they would have put on the king's wedding clothing. Now, maybe it would have been fine for the society's elite. Maybe they could afford clothes of that caliber, at least for this event, but for the commoners, for the people even out at the fringes, they will never, ever get to touch clothing that fine. They'll never get to touch. There's no chance that if they were given a year to prepare for this, they wouldn't be able to afford those clothes. In fact, the gift of these clothes from the king to the wedding guests would have probably been the most prized possession that they had. So when they entered, they were cleaned up and they would have been given this set of wedding clothes so that they could celebrate appropriately the king's son. They weren't supposed to have on their old rags. They were supposed to put on the king's new clothing for them, dressed in his goodness. But there's one person who didn't. It's not because he didn't have the means. It's not because he didn't have the ability just like everybody else. The assumption here is that this gentleman walked in, looked at that, and said, I'm good. I'm good. It's actually, though he received the same invitation as everybody else, his response, though he enters into the room, is the same as the chief priests and the Pharisees. It's a rejection. It's a slap in the face to the king. In fact, it's flaunting his defiant attitude in the middle of the banquet. It's a standing declaration. You guys all bought into this king. I'm here to stand up and stick it to the king. So now it makes a little bit more sense when we read the king's response. He says, then the king told his attendants, tie him hand and foot, chuck him out into the darkness where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. He's now excluded. He now doesn't get to come in, and he's going to be filled with regret and remorse. He's going to see what he could have had. That's the response of the king. He gave him really what he wanted. He didn't want to be a part of the king's banquet. Because he came in, but he didn't really respond. The invitation is different than the response. And then we have this little phrase at the end in verse 14, for many are invited, but few are chosen. It seems kind of exclusive, doesn't it? It seems kind of like maybe something's off with that, but I want you to remember kind of the picture that we have. The understanding that we have about who is deserving and who wasn't deserving in the story. You realize everybody in the story, even the ones who mistreated the servants and even the gentleman who chose not to put on the wedding clothes, they were all invited. They were all welcome at the same level everybody else was. And the only reason they weren't chosen is because they refused to actually come in. See, Jesus is kind of taking this story and saying that there's a synonymous understanding between chosen and the response. There's a synonymous understanding between chosen and deserving. It's not because the king chose the people in the wedding banquet. He pleaded with everybody to come. Go find anyone. That's who gets the invitation. But the only people that are chosen are the ones that actually responded. That's it. That's the choosing. It's the response. That's the deserving. It's the response. And Jesus doesn't care what they look like. He doesn't care whether they're good or bad. He's like, don't try to change before you come in. Just get in the banquet. The food's going bad. The beef's getting cold. The wine's getting warm. Let's take part. It's a feast. It's a celebration. It's a joy to be there. This is the most incredible thing you will ever experience in your life. All you got to do is come in. That's it. You don't even have to worry about the clothes you're bringing in, because the king, he's going to give you something better than you could have anywhere else. That's the kind of king he is. He's like, get them all in here. Clothe them better than they could afford. Give them what they can't get themselves. That's the heart of Jesus. That's the heart of God. That's the kind of king he is. He gives people what they want and doesn't force what they don't want. Now, we've been talking about justice, and maybe you're even sitting here this morning like, I thought we were talking about justice. I don't get it. But you have to understand something. Like we said the last few weeks, we said God's justice isn't about what people, they don't get what they deserve. Right? The deserving was what? It was the response to the invitation. God's justice, his sense of justice, isn't about giving people what they deserve. He gives people what is available and what they need for restoration. He doesn't care if you're good or if you're bad. He doesn't care if you're rich or if you're poor. You could be anybody on the street corner, and the invitation is the same to you. It doesn't even matter how you, like, Jesus doesn't care what you wear. One of the problems in the church, and one of the things we've been accused of, is sometimes they care about their appearances more than they care about the people, and unfortunately that's true. The king in the story doesn't care who sees the people that fill his banquet hall. There's good and they're bad, and this is inappropriate. The king shouldn't be doing that. You're a king. You should have the best people in town. He's like, I just want my wedding hall full. That's all I care. I don't care how much I spend on this. Just get in and fill up the kingdom. That's it. Good and bad. I don't care what you've done. I don't care what you're going to do. Will you just eat with me? I'll provide everything. Just join me. Just say yes. That's all I need. See, God's sense of justice, Jesus' sense of justice is different than our justice. We might not even call it justice. We might call it outrageous kindness. We might call it outrageous compassion and mercy. Because that's what it is. And as I think not just about ourselves, not just about our churches, I think about our city. I think, what would it look like if that sense of God's justice were to flow and sweep through the city? I think most of the time, if we're being honest, we surround ourselves with people that look and think and act like us. But what I love about God's kingdom is it looks different. You could even look around this people, and you might this group of people here this morning, you might not know everybody, but I promise you, there's significant differences between the people here. And it didn't take you being good enough or dressed the right way or to do anything to come in here to experience the presence of God. All it took was a simple yes. That's all it takes. Jesus isn't after your behavior, he's after your yes, that's it. So that's good news for all of us, honestly. If you don't know Jesus today, I want you to hear that. All that Jesus is after today is for you to receive the invitation, and he'll give you the clothes. It doesn't matter what you've done, it doesn't matter what you think, it doesn't even matter today what you believe. All it matters is you say yes, that's it. He'll sort out the rest. The story says he'll take care of it, okay? He'll clean you, he'll clothe you. You just come. But it does mean something for the rest of us as well that are followers of Jesus, or at least profess to be followers of Jesus. It means that we've said yes already, so now what? It means that we're supposed to be the servants who go out and we go to all the street corners and we invite anyone we can, the good and the bad. But here's the problem in the church. We have a specific slice of the social pie that we're after. Statistically in America, the church is set up to reach about 13% of the population. White, upper middle class evangelicals. Well, that's the chief priests and the Pharisees. Not just because of your social status, that's not what I'm saying. We're after those that we're like, based on what I see, those are the people who belong in church. The people who think like me, look like me, act like me. And Jesus is like, wait a second, I need you to understand something. If my church is going to be a church of justice and it's supposed to reflect my kingdom banquet, then we're going to have the good as well as the bad. In fact, we might even be able to say this about God's justice and about the church. I love it. I love it in part because I wrote it down. So, the church is doing the right thing when it's filled with the wrong people. The church is doing the right thing when it's filled with the wrong people. Now, I'm not saying because you are wrong, okay? This isn't a criticism on anybody. I'm saying the church is doing the right thing when we go out to the street corners and we're like, I don't care what you've done. You don't seem like the kind of person that others would think go to church. You're the right candidate. You seem like you shouldn't be in church. Have you ever talked with somebody that's like, I can't set foot in church because lightning might strike? That's the exact kind of person Jesus has invited into the kingdom. Like, no, you got it wrong. I don't deserve to be in the church. I don't know. Can you say yes? Yeah. Then you deserve to be in the church. Because the church is going to look different than what we expect it to look like. If we're after justice, if we're after this restoration, then we have to understand it's not just for the people who look like the chief priests and Pharisees. Of course, they received the invitation long ago, but they rejected it because they trusted in their own wedding clothes. And they wouldn't receive the wedding clothes of the king. And his are infinitely better. They're of a caliber that nobody else has the ability to give or receive or have. Now, I think we can be this kind of a church. I think whatever your opinion is of the church and justice today, I want to give us a few things that we can think about this week that can maybe start to help change that picture. Change the picture, not just in our church, but in every church in Yakima. I think it would change this entire city for the flood of justice just to sweep through if we grabbed hold of a few things. The first one is that we have to confess our unchecked preferences. Okay? And you might want to argue with me on some of that language, and that's fine. You can. But you have to understand something, that everything in our society is built around our individual preferences. Your media usage, your digital online usage, is built with algorithms that identifies what you search, understands that's your preference, and gives you more advertising to give you what you're looking for. You and I live in an echo chamber, and it doesn't stop with our media usage. It goes to the people that we surround ourselves with, the people that think like we think and look like we look. And we start to believe that what we prefer in life is the right thing. We all have preferences. One of the criticisms against this organized religion is that we've raised some of those preferences to the level of doctrine, and we said these are the most important things. Maybe we didn't say it with our words all the time. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we just say it with the people that we choose to invite and not invite, the people that we surround ourselves with and don't surround ourselves with. You see, we have, all of us have preferences, but there's a difference between having preferences that are checked and unintentional and preferences that are checked, like we are aware of what we prefer and understand that that's preference, that's okay. It's okay to have preferences, but we can't equate them with right and wrong. Because then the church, the kingdom of God, will only start to look like the people we think are good. So we have to check our preferences. Another thing is that this one's a little weird, and I can say that because, again, I wrote it. I want to ask us all to change the centerpiece of our tables. Change the centerpiece of your table. And what I mean by that is this. My mom decorated the table at dinner just a couple times a year. And one of the times of the year it was around Thanksgiving. And the other time was Christmas. And she would set up a centerpiece on the table that was themed for that season. You know, maybe it was like the autumn leaves. But my favorite was the candles, like these big candles. And my wife likes that too. She's been doing that around our table. It's really awesome. But just kind of eating with that candlelight and having that feeling at the center of the table, it directed my attention towards something. And it directed my attention around Thanksgiving. I felt actually, like because of the atmosphere that was created, I was able to actually give thanks. I was actually to like participate in this understanding of thankfulness better. The same was true with Christmas. That when my mom would decorate with candles and stuff in the middle of the table that looked Christmassy, Christmas decor, that it actually drew my heart toward that thing. I was like, okay, I'm remembering that this is the season, and as a family, we believe that was because Jesus was the greatest gift the world has ever known. And so I was able to realign my affections. And just as we have preferences of how we look and think and feel and the people we surround ourselves with, the echo chamber that we live in the middle of, we also have something at the center of our table. And I'm not necessarily talking about your dinner table. I'm talking about kind of the table of our hearts. That sometimes we have to take that unchecked preference one step further and say, which one of those or how many of those is living at the center of my attention? It's okay to have preferences, okay? But if my preferences are this table, and I have a lesser preference, I put it at the center, I make that the main thing. And I'm going to start filtering all of my experiences and right through what I put at the center of the table. It's going to draw my attention and focus me on it. We need to replace the center of our table with Jesus. And by Jesus, I'm not equating Jesus with the Bible. The Bible's not Jesus. The Bible shows us Jesus. It's stories about his character and his work. It reveals who he is. It's not Jesus. But we need to put Jesus at the center of the table. And then there's room for the preferences around it, but there's also room for other people around it. We have to have a posture of humility where we're self-examining enough that we can go out into the street corners and we're okay with the good as well as the bad. This is going to cause us to be uncomfortable. But it's a good discomfort. There's bad uncomfortable. Like I like to work out. And there's sometimes I work out a little bit too hard and I'm like, that hurts in a bad way. That's bad discomfort. The good discomfort is when I work out well and I'm just sore the next day. I'm like, going for the summer bod? Hopefully my neighbors won't do this. But we have to check our preferences, right? Like we have to be willing to be uncomfortable. We have to check our preferences and make sure that they're not taking the center place of the table of our heart. It's okay to have your preferences. Just don't leave them unchecked and don't let them take up the center of the table. And finally, and this is the stretching one, this is maybe less internal, more external. This isn't just reflective on our heart. So I want to invite you to do something that will even be more uncomfortable, and that's make friends with people that aren't like you. I think one of the most incredible gifts we can have in the world today that will show people the true love of Jesus is the gift of hospitality. And it doesn't mean just throwing parties at your home. I mean, it could include that. But what I mean is welcoming people into your life and making significant connection and having dwelling moments where you like actually linger and spend time with somebody, but with people that aren't like you. And maybe they even make you uncomfortable. These might be good people. These might be bad people. They're just not your people. Because the King is inviting all of them. And now, if you said yes to Jesus already, you don't just get to receive and say yes to the invitation like everybody else. You're now one of those servants that gets sent out. It's like, hey, will you help me spread the news about this banquet? Go out to all those people, not the good ones, not the ones that you think, yeah, they're in the palace a lot. Go out to the ones that think they're not welcome in the palace and say, no, you are. You are welcome in the palace. I think if we can do that, we're going to start capturing the justice heart of God, and it will flow through our city. It's not just going to stop at your life. It's not just going to stop at this church. It's going to go through the city. In fact, this church is part of the Christian and Missionary Alliance. Okay, it's a worldwide movement, but it didn't start a worldwide movement. In fact, it wasn't intended to start as a movement. It was started by a gentleman named A.B. Simpson. And you can know that if we say somebody and their name starts with two initials, they're important. Okay? I hope by the end of my life to be known by at least just one initial. Okay? You could just D. Kohler and be like, he made it halfway. Okay? So he's a pretty important dude. A.B. Simpson, and he started out as a Presbyterian pastor, early 1900s, Presbyterian pastor in downtown in Manhattan, New York City, okay? And he was a Presbyterian pastor, just as it is in many Presbyterian churches today and many churches across the country, not to throw stones at any particular denomination. It was very white and affluent, okay? Now, it doesn't matter that it was white and affluent. That's actually not the point, but that's the reality of what it was, okay? That's neither good nor bad. It's just what it was. But New York at the time was also experiencing an incredible influx of people from all over the world. Okay, of all different colors, all different occupations, all different backgrounds. And this was a group of people, the immigrants, that were considered a little bit less. Now, they were also people that were in incredible amount of need. And so A.B. Simpson had organized his church to go down to the docks where a lot of them worked or lived in that area, and they would serve them. And the church really liked that. Like, they liked it a lot. They liked going and serving. They didn't have a problem with that. The problem came in when a response started happening. Because the restorative justice was going out through their serving, their church started to reflect those docks. And people started to come in, and then those people were like, ugh, I was good with the serving. I didn't really want to sit next to them. And they started to complain to A.B. Simpson about it. And so he did what any rational person would do. He's like, that's great. I quit. He quit. He quit that same day. They were grumbling. He's like, that's fine. You guys, you can have your church. I'm sorry for ruining it. You have your church. And he walked out his door. He walked down to the docks, and he started a new church. A church that spread into a movement that today is known as the Christian and Missionary Alliance, that has sent so many people around the world and locally that the movement itself is bigger across the world than it is in the United States. And it started out as an organization of people who didn't care what tribe you came from, didn't care what your religious affiliation was, didn't care if you were good or bad. It started as like, do you care about what Jesus did, and will you be in an alliance of people who care about what Jesus did and want to live that authentically? Cool, you're in the Christian Alliance. Do you care about sending those servants to invite people to the banquet? Cool, you're in the Missionary Alliance. I don't like board meetings, let's put them together. Christian and Missionary Alliance. That's who we are. We're a people. We have a lineage in this building of an organization that started reluctantly because they didn't want to stop at serving. They wanted to continue it on into the invitation. They wanted to be with people that weren't like them. And if the other people couldn't do that with him, Simpson was going to go and start it with people who will. That's who we need to be. That's the story we need to carry out. Like, let's be accused of things that don't make sense to people who many would think you should be in the kingdom of God. Let's do the things that only make sense to the people who look wrong for the kingdom of God. That's justice. That's justice for the city. Let's pray.